At Arizona State University, we've made online education better, smarter, and more personalized so you can go further in your aspiring field.
I decided to pursue medicine once I realized that ASU did have the online program for biological sciences. You're still required to learn the same curriculum. You're still being tested on the same content that anyone would be tested on in person. The comprehensiveness of the program prepared me so well for medical school.
Explore over 350 plus programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
Hey everyone, this is Peter Zablocki, the host of the Daily History Shorts podcast. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. If this is your first time stopping by, I hope you stick around and return tomorrow for more fun history. And if you enjoy these Friday conversation series, you can always find the entire backlog of conversations with historians, authors, Pulitzer Prize winners, and much more under the Conversations tab on our website at www.historyshortspodcast.com.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Today's conversation is proudly brought to you by The Collector, your destination for captivating stories that teach, inform, and inspire millions of readers every day. From ancient history to today's defining moments, from philosophy and art to exclusive interviews, discover more at thecollector.com. My guest today is David Chaffetz, an independent scholar with a passion for Middle Eastern and Inner Asian history. His latest book, a New York Times bestseller, Raiders, Rulers, and Traders, The Horse and the Rise of Empires, takes us on an epic journey across 3,000 years of Eurasian history. In this captivating work, Chaffetz reveals how the humble horse wasn't just a mode of transport, but a revolutionary force that powered the rise of mighty empires. From the wild steppes where horses were first domesticated in the Bronze Age, to the lightning conquest of the Mongols under Khan, and the intricate trade networks that spanned from China to the Ottoman lands, he argues that horses were the oil of ancient civilizations, driving warfare, commerce, social mobility, and even cultural symbols in art and mythology. Drawing on cutting-edge genetics, archaeology, and forgotten archives, David reframes the Silk Road as the Horse Road, showing how nomadic raiders, ambitious rulers, and savvy traders intertwined in a cycle of triumph and downfall, all fueled by these remarkable animals. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Peter. It's great to be here.
So let's start with you. What is your journey to falling in love with history, being interested in Asian history, and how did all of that lead to this research and this book?
So it's interesting that you call it a journey. My first book was called A Journey Through Afghanistan, published originally in 1982, I think, and since republished several times. The Journey Through Afghanistan is about how I, together with a friend from college, went to Afghanistan, bought horses in the traditional horse market, and then rode those horses about a quarter way through the country into the regions which were not served by roads at the time. So we were very much in contact with people who live by and for horses, some of whose characters I write about a little bit in this new book. So that's the journey. Why did we go to Afghanistan? There's a lot of serendipity behind it, but I basically grew up in a house full of readers. There were hundreds of history books lying around, so I had access to them when I was a kid. And I really admired my older cousins who were studying Latin and Greek. So I said, well, I'm going to study Latin and Greek too. And one thing led to another, and we started going further and further east, starting off with Turkish and then going on to Persian. And then, at some point I learned Chinese. So it has been a journey. And the good news is that because that journey has been going on for most of my life, the book is really, in a way, a distillation of a lot of things that I've been studying and thinking about for 50 years, without which it would have been very hard to put that book together.
Did you always plan on, I'm going to get to this book, this is going to happen? Or was it like one day you were just like, all right, I think it's time for me to write all this down?
So that's a really great question. The famous passage in Gibbon's Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire when he says it was on, I think, August 16th, 1783, when I was sitting in the ruins of the Forum Julii in Rome and listening to the barefoot friars chant the Vespers in the Temple of Jupiter, that the idea came to me. This is a very rough paraphrase. The idea came to me to write this book. There was such a moment when I started to realize that everything was about the horse. And a friend who's written and, more importantly, read a huge number of books about Asia, I bounced that idea off of him, and he said, that sounds like a good thing for a book. I said, I think it could be handled in a small essay. He said, oh, no. And he was right, because when I started to write, it just blew up.
So you compared a horse to 20th century petroleum or oil, right, as a form of transportable wealth. And you reframed the Silk Road more accurately as a horse road even, right, where horse breeding and trade served as this economic connective tissue that drove trade and social mobility. Can you maybe elaborate on that?
Well, the reason why I wasn't very comfortable with the implied explanation of the Silk Road is that the Silk Road suggests that there are luxury products, mainly Chinese, which have to be transferred from one group of rich people in one part of Europe, Asia, to another group of people in Eurasia who are also rich. And everything in between is just sort of a blank space with people we don't care about, who never contributed anything to civilization. Why would we bother learning about them? And by the way, when we go there today, there's nothing to see. It turns out that this space between China and, let's say, the Middle East or Europe was a very vibrant space. Of course, it was a less densely populated region than China or the Roman Empire. It was not as urban a place, although there were cities. But it turned out to have been terribly important economically, socially, culturally. There was the basin for a lot of world religions to kind of travel across Eurasia, including Christianity and Zoroastrianism and Buddhism. So these people contributed a huge amount to the world history, and they did this by interchanging not luxury products, but items of everyday consumption and use, including horses and other livestock and other steppe products, if you will. But horses were the most valuable and, in a way, strategically, the most important product that they were moving across the steppe.
Yeah, you also mentioned in your research the newest findings with regards to like DNA and other things that showcase how horses were particularly bred. Like you would ultimately try to improve a product.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we have a lot of DNA evidence for specific races of horses, although huge progress is being made in that area. And there's a researcher, um, Ludovico Orlando in France, who has a massive database of horse remains and is examining their DNA. But we know from other evidence that certain nations around the steppe specialized in raising certain kind of horses. And, it's a case of horses for courses. If you lived in a mountainous region like Afghanistan, your horses would have been known for being very sure-footed and perfect for crossing the Hindu Kush, for example. Whereas if you're raising horses in Turkmenistan, what do you need? You need a horse that thinks it's a camel and can travel for 3 days without drinking water, which for a horse is very unusual. Horses are very similar to humans in their need to drink water. But the Turkmen people managed to breed horses that could travel for many days without water. So each region specialized in a horse, and the market sort of allowed those breeds to go from one part of the world to another, depending on what people were looking for in a horse.
Military plays a big role in the book. The book also highlights the vulnerability of sedentary societies to horse-mounted raiders. Specifically, like when you think of Zhang Nu's pressure on Han China, what military countermeasures did empires like China, for example, develop in a response to this horse warfare, and were they often sufficient or insufficient?
Well, they were sufficient. The empires, sedentary empires that were on the defensive, had massive resources, and they didn't just sit there and let themselves get picked off by these crazy raiders crossing the frontier. They would mobilize large armies. They would go pursue the raiders into their own pastures. They would decimate their flocks. They would poison their wells. They would do all the kinds of things that a big empire can do against a pastoralist people. And the pastoralist people were therefore did not undertake these raids assuming that nothing bad would happen to them. However, the cost of these campaigns invading the steppe with a large cavalry army of horses that had to be procured, that had to be trained, that had to be replaced when they died or when they were ill, was a huge burden on the Chinese Empire. Similar, a huge burden on all the other empires, the Mughal Empire, various Iranian regimes. Keeping that cavalry in the field was just very costly, whereas raiding cost nothing. They had no cost to raid. They only had an upside because if they could either carry off slaves, enslave people, carry them off, carry off booty, or simply irritate the empire enough to get a kind of a protection money in return for promising to stop raiding, they would be better off. So this asymmetry of resources is what caused the anguish on the part of the established empires, the sedentary empires. How do we get rid of these troublesome horsemen without going bankrupt?
You do mention the idea of I never thought of it as such when you think of the Great Wall of China, almost as a way to stop raiders, right? To stop horse-mounted military.
You look at a wall like that and you say, well, how could that have prevented a real military campaign? The answer is it would not have prevented a real military campaign. So if an army from the steppes got together with artillery, which, for example, in the 18th century, some of the Mongols, nations of Eastern Mongolia, absolutely had, and they had mercenary soldiers from further west who knew how to deploy artillery in combat. So for a real army, it would have been easy to blow through the wall and invade. But if you're only thinking about stopping raiders on horseback, it's not bad because they can't just run over the wall. The garrison on the wall can call for reinforcements by using signals, and it's relatively dissuasive. Remember, the other thing that the wall was used for was simply to concentrate the horse dealers as they were coming from Mongolia, and give them a place to camp while they were engaging in buying and selling horses. So the wall was not purely a military border; it was also a kind of a market frontier where people could trade freely outside the empire.
Dave, if you had to pick one military leader or even like whose fate and historic relevance is most tied to their mastery of the horse, who do you think it would be and why?
So it has to be a toss-up between Tamerlane and Genghis Khan. I would say Genghis Khan gets credit. Running an empire based on horses from a military point of view is a no-brainer. But keeping horsemen in the field and making sure that the horses have enough fodder for them to carry out the campaign or enough pasture for them to carry out the campaign, and making sure that everybody follows orders and making sure that everyone shows up on the battlefield at the right moment is an enormous intellectual challenge. How Genghis Khan solved that problem at the scale that he solved it is still, I think, is still unexplainable. Because remember, Mongol armies crossed territories with fronts 10 to miles wide, and then they would converge at a certain point. And the enemy could not believe it because how do you get all those people to come at the same time and at the same point and concentrate for battle? So this intellectual aspect of it shows that Genghis Khan was an amazing military leader. Tamerlane did more or less the same thing, but he also was able to bring artillery, which adds another layer of complexity and another logistical effort to the whole thing. Plus, he led a professional army, which was basically in the field for 20 years without ever stopping. And Genghis Khan was not as warlike as some people think. After he conquered what he thought he needed to conquer, he went home to Mongolia and enjoyed himself going on hunts and playing with the grandchildren. Tamerlane never did that. He died at age 70 on his last campaign to conquer China. So there's something persistent about Tamerlane, which is just remarkable.
Beyond their practical roles, horses also held deep cultural and symbolic importance, inspired art, poetry, religious motifs across diverse traditions. Can you point to any single linguistic borrowing or artifact from your research that kind of really stood out to you?
The words for horses themselves and different kinds of horses are quite interesting. So, for example, the Mongols gelded their horses. And in Mongolian, a gelded horse is called a morin, something like that. And it turns out that morin is the common Russian word for gelding. Uh, so we the Russian consider gelded horses somehow or another synonymous with Mongolian horses. Now, in French, I'm speaking from Paris. In French, the word for gelding is an hongre, Hongre. Well, that obviously comes from Hungarian because the French encountered the Hungarians and they also gelded their horses because most steppe people gelded their horses. It's not easy to pasture horses on the open steppe with too many stallions because stallions by nature want to create a harem of mares to go with them and go off. And if you have a herd of 100 horses, you really only want to have one stallion or two stallions. Otherwise, everyone goes their own direction. So I find it interesting the way many European languages have a word for gelding, which comes from a steppe language, Mongolian in the case of the Russians, and Hungarian in the case of the French.
So, how long, because people don't always realize, did it take you to research and write this book?
Well, I alluded to at the beginning that I've been
It's a journey.
years. Uh, I had read most of the main primary sources, either in the original language or in translation, over the course of the last 50 years. And the advantage is when you've read all the main sources, you kind of know what you're talking about. But what I found fascinating was that when you did a deep dive into anything, any question, gelding, horse colors of horses' coats, horseshoes, stirrups always a big thing. You find a monographic literature that goes on through the hundreds of articles. And so I probably consulted about 5,000 articles because what I was trying to do is get behind the main narrative. The main narrative is pretty well known, and there's a lot of books that will tell you about Genghis Khan or they will tell you about Tamerlane. But then these weird questions that come up. Uh, for example, were the numbers of Mongol troops in the field exaggerated? And for many years, journalist historians said, well, of course they were exaggerated, because these people just plucked the word 100,000 out of the air. But there are specialists. For example, on that topic, there's a writer named Wilbur Smith who looked at the pasture area available to the Mongols in their different campaigns and calculated per acre how many horses could they support. And he came to the conclusion that the numbers of horses in Genghis Khan's army, which could have been fielded given the environmental conditions, were consistent with the numbers reported by Genghis Khan's later historians, the Persian historians who wrote about him, because they were working for his descendants. And so that kind of detailed work is fascinating. And some of the things are rabbit holes in which you can just spend weeks going into and not coming out.
I love the fact you brought up this idea of people are just, even older historians. So thousands, they throw out these numbers. It's kind of like today, a lot of people throw out, many historians have said. And I'm always like, all right, who are the many historians that have said? That's like a
Right.
common one.
But these things go in and out of fashion. So in the 19th century, people just repeated what was written in the original texts like Rashid-ud-Din or The Secret History of the Mongols, which are our main sources for the Mongol Empire from the inside. And then, of course, we have the European travelers who went to Mongolia during the Middle Ages, and we have their testimony too. So the first step was to translate everything that they wrote and print it and make modern editions. Then there was kind of a reaction to that and saying, well, these people didn't know what they were talking about. They were making numbers up. They were trying to flatter their kings. It kind of implied that you couldn't trust anything coming out of these people because they're from far away and a long time ago. And then what I find wonderful is that we're rediscovering that these sources, particularly reshaped, tried as hard as possible to tell us the real story.
So what are you working on next? Did you kind of arrive at your next topic from this one?
Well, one of the things that I didn't get to spend enough time on in this book is the role of the horse in kind of defining the boundary between Europe and Asia. So I've written a little monograph, which I'm trying to publish now, on intellectual discussion about where was the frontier between Europe and Asia. And I've spoken with some people in Poland, which is, as you know, a country where horses are very, very important. And I think there's a book about the ambiguity of whether a country is part of Europe or part of the steppe throughout a period of history, maybe from 500 till 1800, and that affects several countries, including Poland, Hungary, Russia, Lithuania. And then there's this culture of horses that remains in Eastern Europe, which is so similar to the steppe culture. And so I thought that would be a fun topic, and I'm going to do some research on that. And in the meantime, I'm also working on a book which deals with modern Polish history and the ways in which the Poles resisted German occupation.
Wow, I have to get you in touch with Adam Zamoyski, Professor Dr. Davies. Where can my listeners go to learn more about your work and what you're up to?
The most obvious thing to do would be to go down to your local bookstore and buy
That's
the book.
right.
However, if you're busy and you want a taste of the book, there's a couple of things. I have a website which is called Raiders, Rulers, and Traders with dashes between the words. I'm on X, I'm on Blue Sky, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Facebook, and I'm posting new research that I've uncovered since I wrote the book, so that readers or people who are following me can get new information which wasn't available to me when I wrote the book. And I must add that this is a moving target. There's a huge amount of interesting new research going on that, if it doesn't contradict what I wrote, at least it takes it in different directions. So the journey continues, so to speak.
David, before I let you go, I kind of asked this fun-esque question at the end. Obviously, you mentioned this at the beginning. You grew up in a household full of books, and you've read so many books in your life. If I was to look at your bookcase that you've had your whole life, what two books do you think I would definitely find on that bookshelf?
Well, you mentioned it, Norman Davies. I think Norman Davies' book on Europe is an amazing book. I learned so much from it. And that book is a very big, thick black book, which sits right in the middle of this bookcase over here. So if you were looking, just sort of scanning,
literally,
Davies' book, you'd say, "Oh, Norman Davies' book on Europe," and it is a great book and well worth reading. And then you would probably notice that I have a library of Persian, Arabic, and Turkish books, so you wouldn't necessarily notice, but also I have a copy of Rashid ad-Din's History of the Mongols in Persian, so you would see that one too.
David, thank you so much for taking the time today. This was really a pleasure.
Talking to you, Peter, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Next week on the Conversation Series, author Matthew Algeo talks about his newest book, New York's Secret Subway, The Underground Genius of Alfred Beach and the Origins of Mass Transit.
There wasn't a lot of interest, a lot of enthusiasm for investing money in this weird scheme to build a pneumatic tube underground to carry people in the city that was basically the world capital of corruption at the time. He gets the charter to build it in January, March of 1873, and it's just a couple months later that the financial panic hits. And so he was not able to raise money. It definitely delayed the construction of subways in New York. And what happened was, after this plan failed, there was a small elevated railroad line that went up Greenwich Street, and finally people threw up their arms and said, let's just build elevated railroads. It's easiest to do. You don't have to dig tunnels. They're loud, they're messy. Nobody really liked them, but as a practical matter, they were relatively easy to build. And that's what happened. A lot of people, even New Yorkers, don't realize Manhattan was covered with elevated railroads really until the 1920s. And then when the subway construction began around 1903, then finally the subways replaced the elevated railroads.